describe this subset of beer, though, did not come into vogue until the 1800s, and even later in some parts of the world. Beer generally sufficed. Beer was and is understood to be fermented grain, whatever the grain might be, plus seasoning. That seasoning before modern times might have been as varied as tree bark, plant roots, and herbs such as rosemary and thyme. Hops, a crisply bitter flower, became standard only in the 15th century. Before then, hops would have been known mostly as a medicine, a reputation that continued even after their integration into beer. Lord Sidmouth, a British Prime Minister under George III, was said to have recommended a pillow full of hops to aid his sovereign's sleep. Because of the lack of filtration and the conditions under which beer fermented, usually in open vessels, bits of these herbs, barks, roots, and hops showed up floating in the finished product, rendering it that much darker, that much less clear. Yeast's role in converting the sugars of the grains into intoxicating ethanol wasn't fully understood yet, but the detritus from that top fermenting yeast would often show up too, slinky, slippery little gobs that looked not unlike mold spores. For thousands upon thousands of years, this was beer, even as the monks' large-ish ad hoc operations gave way to standardization, and to the first hints of commercial brewing, by which designated brewers made beer for profit under this or that government license, and some did quite well, given their pre-industrial limitations. In 1610 in Munich, capital of the brewing juggernaut, which was then the independent dukedom of Bavaria, nearly 1 in 5 commercial brewers belonged to the highest level of taxpayers. All 32 of Antwerp's commercial breweries, by the late 1660s, belonged to that Dutch city's wealthiest 5%. The beers they produced did gradually shed some of the herbs and barks, etc., settling on malted barley, water, and hops as the main ingredients. Again, yeast was largely a mystery, and styles began to take shape, though all beer remained more or less inky and thick ales. What's more, ale seeped into culture, both popular and highbrow, becoming that much more synonymous with beer. Ale in Central and Northern Europe was a drink for both the commoner and the lord of the manor, a reassuring everyday accoutrement to existences that were often nasty, brutish, and short. Would I were in an alehouse in London! I would give all my fame for a pot of ale and safety, Shakespeare would have a character declare in Act 3 of Henry V, written in the late 1590s. It is better to think of church in the alehouse than to think of the alehouse in church, went a quotation attributed to Protestant reformer Martin Luther. Such a big imbiber that his friends nicknamed him the King of Hops. Even if Shakespeare, who died in 1611, and Luther, who died in 1546, had somehow lived all the way into the late 1800s, they would still have been familiar with any beer they might have encountered in their native lands, for it changed little in the intervening 2 centuries. Then it changed a lot, and fast. Chapter 2. Lager and its rivals. 1516 to 1818, Ingolstadt, Bavaria. Wilhelm Wittelsbach was 23 when he ascended to the throne of the Duchy of Bavaria in March 1508 upon the death of his father. A later print showed a stout man with a square jaw covered in a wiry brown beard. He looked intense and burdened. Maybe so, for Wilhelm's family had controlled the statelet of Bavaria, which by the time of his ascension covered much of what would become southern Germany, including bits of the Tyrolean Alps in present-day Italy, since the late 1100s. Agriculture was the major industry, and hops were among the major crops. Not inconsequentially, beer was a major part of the Bavarian economy and the duchy's culture. But as beer made that transition from monastic byproduct to commercial staple in the late Middle Ages, its quality had degraded. Brewers, even in beer-crazy Bavaria, were still tossing in herbs, roots, even soot to both pad out their recipes and hide defects as they hustled to meet demand. Duke Wilhelm IV, as he styled himself, sought to put a stop to such practices. He also wanted to prevent brewers from using wheat as a grain in beer. Better to have that for bread to feed his subjects, and to stop what had become wild and wide fluctuations in the price of beer.